for joining our panel discussion titled Strengthening Relationships with the Community and Law Enforcement, Addressing Systemic Biases regarding Race and Ethnicity. So this is a co-sponsored event by the Moscow Human Rights Commission and the Latah Human Rights Task Force. And this is the first session of what will be an ongoing series. So with that in mind, if you are ready to kind of think about this in the future, go ahead and mark your calendars for our next discussion that's going to be occurring on December 8th at 5 p.m. And we're going to continue to explore how to strengthen these relationships with community and law enforcement through the lens of the mental health and crisis intervention. So please join us for that. We hope you can, and keep your eyes out for the next Zoom link. My name is Erin Agidius. I am the Director of the Office of Civil Rights and Investigations at the University of Idaho. And as a committee member of the Moscow Human Rights Commission, I am your moderator tonight. So I want to start our conversation with a brief introduction about why we're here and the purpose of this discussion, and then I'll briefly cover our ground rules and introduce our panelists. So to that end, let me lay a little bit of the foundation for this conversation. With the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was brought about by the tragic deaths of both Black men and women at the hands of law enforcement, the Moscow community really wants to take a proactive approach to prevent unnecessary deaths of this nature from happening in our community to people of color. So the Moscow Police Department already follows a community policing model, and we want to be intentional in our efforts to really further that goal by building relationships between law enforcement and people of color. The Moscow Police Department and the University of Idaho have actively and collaboratively engaged in related trainings and conversations, and this is an ongoing partnership that will continue. But I think it's important to note that these efforts and experiences don't stop at campus boundaries. The goal of this and our future discussions is really to build and strengthen and enhance the relationship between people of color and local law enforcement in line with ongoing community policing efforts. To know the experiences of people of color and law enforcement as a community, we must be open to challenging and at times uncomfortable conversation. This is necessary to build relationships. These relationships of trust and understanding don't happen overnight and can't happen with just this one conversation. Like any relationship, it takes an ongoing commitment, conversation, and continuous learning to foster and advance such critical community connections, which is why I'm really pleased to moderate this discussion tonight with our community leaders and panelists. Their attendance, I think, really demonstrates their commitment to nurturing this relationship, not just now, but in the future. So before I introduce our panelists, I have some ground rules for us all to keep in mind throughout this conversation. First, I just encourage everyone to be an active listener. Although we are in a webinar format, you will have the opportunity to submit questions throughout the discussion. And I encourage you to do so, as your questions may be informed by a lot of our ongoing discussion. You can submit your questions by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Second, our panelists, and in turn you all who submit questions, should be speaking from their own experiences using I language rather than attempting to generalize experiences. Third, this is really a discussion. Respectful challenging of ideas is appropriate, but we want to make sure personal attacks don't occur. And lastly, the goal of our conversation today is not to reach a consensus or an agreement. It's not to convince someone of a viewpoint. Rather, the purpose is to examine different viewpoints and gain a deeper understanding. So my role as moderator is to ensure really that we are all following these rules. While I do want to allow for as much robust discussion as possible, it's important for us all to note that we have set aside about 1 hour for our panelists to answer and discuss questions that have been prepared in advance, and then about an additional half hour for the panelists to respond to any input or questions that are sent in by our community and webinar attendees as we go along. So please, again, feel free to submit those questions throughout the discussion tonight by using that Q&A option in the menu at the bottom of your screen. We've already received a few questions in advance of the session tonight, and while I hope we have enough time to get to all of them, if we don't, please know that we hope to continue these conversations. We can all play a part in building these relationships, so I'd highly encourage you to reach out to our panelists if your question happens to go unanswered this evening. So without further ado, I want to make sure I introduce our community leaders, our partners, and tonight's panelists. And to our panelists, after I introduce you, if there's anything that I've missed, please feel free to jump in and share a brief sentence or two about maybe what you're currently doing or planning to do with regard to building community relations in law enforcement and people of color. So first, I'd like to introduce Chief of Police James Fry with the Moscow Police Department. He was selected for this role in 2016, but really began his career with the Moscow Police Department in 1993 and has served in various capacities, almost every single one since that time. In addition to a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's from the University of Idaho, he has over 1,700 hours of additional law enforcement training and graduated from the 275th session of the FBI National Academy. Next, I'd like to introduce Sheriff Richard Skiles, who is the Latah County Sheriff's Office and was born in Moscow. He has served in the Marines for 4 years as a Lance Corporal and later joined the Latah County Sheriff's Office in 1996. This is where he really has had the opportunity as a deputy to gain experience, connect with people, and throughout the entire county, and is what ultimately prompted him to run for this office and ultimately be selected. Dr. Yolanda Bisbee is the Chief Diversity Officer and Executive Director of Tribal Relations at the University of Idaho, and is an enrolled Nez Perce tribal member and has a rich Hispanic background. Dr. Bisbee has 30+ years of work experience at the University of Idaho and is a first-generation college student who is very knowledgeable of the barriers facing multicultural students at the secondary and post-secondary levels. Tremaine Gaither is currently the coordinator for the Mindfulness-Based Emotional and Social Intelligence Certificate Program for Washington State University Honors College, where he works to train students in mindfulness, self-awareness, self-management, empathy, and compassion. He's currently serving as the co-chair of the Police Advisory Board at WSU and has previously served as an appointed board member of the Mecklenburg County Community Relations Committee. Oh, that's a tongue twister, from 2012 to 2016, where he led the Know Your Rights initiative for the city of Charlotte, informing marginalized communities of their rights within policing practices. So I want to make sure that if there's anything that I missed, Chief Fry, Sheriff Skiles, Dr. Bisbee, or Mr. Gaither, that you would like to highlight about your experiences, I want to make sure I give pause, because I recognize I may not know it all. So I'll give you just a brief moment if you'd like to chime in.
You did great, Erin.
Perfect. All right. So without further delay, then let's dive in. I really want to begin on the topic of community policing, which I think for those of you who are joining and maybe not familiar, and it's really about a collaborative effort between police and communities to identify problems within the community, but it also seeks the community's assistance in search of solutions to these problems. So I'd like to direct maybe our first question to our law enforcement friends and find out from Chief Fry and Sheriff Skiles, would you describe your approach or philosophy as a department, as community policing? And if you would, what are your efforts to achieve this? What does that look like?
Thanks, Erin. I'll go ahead and start. The Moscow Police Department has probably encompassed the community policing philosophy since the early 1990s. We believe that the community is the police and the police are the community. We try to hire officers who are going to be community oriented, and we actually reach out to community members through programs that we have to try to bolster our relations with not only with just the university, with the focus group and new things that we've created here recently, but through the Lee Newbill Safety Fair and the Citizens Police Academy, which we've had for 21 years now. We continue to reach out with these programs, but I think the biggest thing that we do and we continue to strive to do is make ourselves available to different community members and groups to foster our relationships.
Excellent. Sheriff Skiles, what about, I guess, the county sheriffs? What's the approach for that department? Does it follow a community policing model as well? And what does that look like?
So I would say that it's definitely, so I started at Latah County Sheriff's Office in 1996. And the role that I played for 12 years there was the community policing deputy. So I had opportunities to advance, take promotion, go to full time, but I always stayed at community policing. I really believe in the small communities, and I believe the effort you put in there really makes a big difference. So for 12 years at the Latah County Sheriff, I stayed as a community policing deputy in that community policing position. So I really strongly believe in it, always have.
What kind of skills do you think law enforcement officers and leaders need in order to make community policing work in our community?
First of all, I think it takes leadership that has the mind. Chief Fry and I both are on the same page for the community policing since I started, and he started about a year before I did. When I started, when I was elected in the position, we started off with meetings right off the bat to talk to each other, find out where we can help each other as far as education and doing better for our communities and everything. Chief Fry is primarily responsible for the city of Moscow. He does a really good job there, so I kind of just let that go. And I really oversee the small communities like Deary and Troy, everything outside of Moscow. And I spent a lot of time working hard to make sure that community policing was something we sought for. And so to answer that question completely, I guess, is leadership has to believe in the community policing aspect. So once the leadership is you get the right leadership, then they hire and train deputies and patrolmen to be the people they need them to be for the community policing. So like for us, we take about 3 months to hire somebody. For me personally, I'm very, very particular who I hire. They go through a background check, polygraph. I'll send a detective out to the community that they're from and see what kind of person they are. I need to really get a good fit for community policing, and we do a psych eval. We do all kinds of things. It takes 3 months to go through all this hiring process. So if someone just quits and put in a 2-week notice, it takes me actually 3 months to replace that person. I have a really low, actually, I'm pretty proud of my low turnover rate. And I've actually had 6 employees come back to the sheriff's office that have done a really good job there and had left for some reason, for family reasons or whatever, or a different job opportunity. And I've had 6 come back in 4 years. So I'm pretty proud of that. That says a lot about your work environment and things like that as far as your community policing goes.
Absolutely.
I know I rambled, but thank you very much for listening.
No, that's all right. I think you're spot on in terms of, creating an environment where people want to work. And I think that does feed into making sure that our officers are engaged in positive community relations, which is kind of what we want when we're doing that community policing effort. Chief Fry, I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to add in terms of the skills that law enforcement officers and leaders really need to make community policing work in our community.
I think Sheriff Skiles was right when he said that it does start from the top. It starts with command. We have to believe in the community policing philosophy before the officers will engage in that and understand what it is. When we hire people, we look for people that have a heart to serve all community members. We're looking at individuals who have that servant attitude to uphold the core values of the Moscow Police Department of service, pride, integrity, compassion, and excellence. But it is a culture that you have to foster, and you have to continue to work on that in order to grow and become better.
That ongoing commitment, which is, I think, one of those things we've talked about when we first started our conversation, is making sure that we're continuing that commitment. It's not we got to keep going and keep the conversation at the forefront. So I will throw it back to you again, Chief Fry, real quick. I guess quick is up to you, but what kind of barriers do you think have you encountered when it comes to community policing? And conversely, what are some of those successes that you've had or you've seen in that work?
I think some of the barriers are, we're trying to live down some history, past and present. We have things that have happened in our profession that are unacceptable, and we have to continue to build our trust in the community, to continue those relationships. we have different trust issues with different diversity groups because of either the way that they've been treated elsewhere where they grew up, or maybe even some things that we've done that didn't come across as very professional. Hiring is always a barrier for us. We're in a limited area here, and not a lot of people are applying for jobs right now, so that is a barrier for us as well. But some of our successes, that's an interesting concept, because sometimes we feel like we're successful, but others may see it as you're just kind of doing what you should have been doing all along. So I think, having these discussions and continuing to have open panels and open discussions with our community will help our successes in the future, and building those relationships can continue. So it's important for us to do that.
Kind of on that note, one of the questions that kind of is relevant to that discussion that's come in from one of our community members is, what are the things that Moscow PD is doing to diversify the department with people from bilingual, bicultural, or different backgrounds?
I think some of that comes down to our hiring practices. We're reaching out to different hiring sites to try to gather more applicants from different diversity groups. We've had, in my time as chief, we've had more female officers than we've ever had. So I think that's a great success for us. That brings a whole different positive dynamic to policing. And, there's different, people see things differently. And that's a good thing in law enforcement, is we have to continue to be open to different ideas and different philosophies.
Awesome, thank you. I want to make sure, Sheriff Skiles, that if there's any other barriers or successes that you can speak to with regard to community policing from the county perspective, that I would like to hear if you have any additional thoughts on top of what Chief Frye has already discussed.
Not really too much. I think it's really, I think it's important to have diversity in the department itself. So like, I have an Asian male that works for me. I have several females that work for me. I think, and I would hire anybody that I thought would do the job. It really wouldn't matter what race or skin color or any of that kind of stuff. I really want people that can do the job, that have a heart for the citizens, and have that passion to do the job right. So I have an Asian male who does an outstanding job, and I just love having that guy go out and he takes calls, and if he has to deal with any kind of race issues at all, he handles things really well. He just, if someone calls him a name or something, I've actually been with him on calls when somebody will say something rude to him because he is actually an Asian male, and he's like, that's okay. And he's really, really cool. That kind of stuff doesn't bother him. And that's the kind of people you hire, is just people that want to do the right thing. There's always going to be somebody that calls you a name or is racist or whatever. We deal with that kind of stuff on a regular basis. Even as a white peace officer, we deal with people calling us pig, or we deal with people calling us all kinds of different names. And we don't have to be a different race to be made fun of, for sure. So you just hire the right people and you train them well. We have training. We go to the state of Idaho requires, I believe it's 40 hours a year, isn't it, Chief Frye? I know that our guys get, is it 20 or 40?
40 every 2 years, so you have to have a minimum of at least 20.
So, right, it's 20 a year, and every one of my guys go to more training than just the limited amount. We don't go, hey, we're at our 20 and we stop. We have a very, our county commissioners have given us a very really nice budget for training. So I have about $50,000 in my training budget, and we train. It's important for me to have deputies that go out in the field that are educated, that have gone to all kinds of different kinds of training. So if they come to your call, they can handle the situation as best as possible because of the training they get, the compassion they have, the heart that they have for the job, and the experience they have. And so it's super important for me to make sure, when I first took office 4 years ago, our training budget, I believe, was around $30,000, and I've almost doubled that. And because it's important for me to have my deputies trained properly, my jail trained properly, so people are treated properly.
I think, wanting to make sure that we have that training and that foundational base knowledge is excellent, and particularly that ongoing training, right? I think the things that we're doing now, and we're continuing to learn new things all the time, not just within the realm and sphere of police work, but how that intersects with our community and our relationships with our community. So I think that's one of those excellent things to hear. I do want to make sure that I give Mr. Gaither and Dr. Bisbee an opportunity to kind of continue the conversation on community policing. So similar to my earlier questions, and maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Gaither, if that's all right. What kind of skills do you think law enforcement and community leaders need to have to make community policing work?
Good question. For me, I believe is strong interpersonal and social training. And the type of interpersonal and social training that is more scenario based, where they're not in front of a PowerPoint presentation learning about it, but they're in real simulated trainings. I think that's important for, because of the job of police officers, just to have that human interaction skill, to have those skills. I think that's very important for our community leaders, not only our police officers, but all leaders. I would also say that another important training is implicit bias training. I think it's important for us all to be aware of our own biases and how we may define or come up with our own self-definition of who a person is in that initial interaction or that initial meeting. So yeah, I think implicit bias training is also very important right now.
Can I?
Dr. Bisbee. Oh, go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
I would just like to say really quick, I agree with him. So when we go through post, we go through an academy. You just don't get a star or a shield and you get to go get in a patrol car and chase people around. We go through not only, I guess what I'd say, and Chief Fry can probably, because he's been on the post council, but we go through hours of scenario training, and I personally have been through a lot of that scenario training. So he's right. Scenario training is really a serious thing, and Post Academy, where we train to begin with when we start our career, does a lot of scenario training, and it's very important. And we do, we'll have a Black person in training, and so it's really kind of neat, because then you can actually filter out, are people biased or are people racist or whatever. And so the training, and not just Black people, but we have different races, or we'll have a female or whatever in any kind of scenario, and it really helps us. It helps us with that helps us with the bias training too, because if you see a certain race, or a female, you might be biased right off the bat and not really be aware of it, but you might be, you probably are.
Right. Yeah, I think that unconscious bias is really it's one of those that makes it so challenging to address, because we don't always know it's there, and it takes that scenario-based learning, I think, that we're talking about to really kind of identify what that might look like for us individually. So I think that's great. Dr. Bisbee, do you have any other thoughts on the skills that law enforcement or community leaders really need to make community policing work?
So I come from a different approach, I guess, and I kind of look at the systems approach. And I agree with all of what everybody said about what needs to happen. But the one thing that I was really curious about when I started looking at community policing due to our conversations with the Moscow Police Department was really looking at the history of the practice of community policing. And what I found was that the original intent, of course, was a collaboration between the police and the community to address crime prevention and solve community problems. That was what it was back in the 70s. And it was to gain allyship to help solve community problems by voicing concerns, offer advice, and then take action to address those concerns. And what it's grown over the years is to build trust, and more recently to change officer behavior and reduce force against civilians. So the history of community policing has changed a lot. What isn't mentioned a lot in the community policing framework is that the way it's set up is that the responsibility is falling on the police to change the structural racism that issues that exist within our communities. And to me, after looking at some of the research and articles, is that it's really a structural problem, and we're putting the problem on an enforcement agency to correct the problem. And what we're seeing now is that it needs a more collaborative community approach where everybody's engaged, and it's not just falling on the police to solve all the community issues. So that's where I come from in looking at this when trying to address those. So some of the things that I feel that need to happen are training and a willingness to be uncomfortable to address those personal biases that we just talked about. But that training does not only include the police department, it needs to include the community members and all the stakeholders. And that may be the city council, it may be the commission, but it involves everybody. I feel like Moscow's a small enough community that if our vision or our mission is to be an inclusive community, then we should be able to all come together to work through the structural racism to create that environment for everyone, including our students on campus. I think another part is effective communication skills to bring together a spectrum of diverse voices. You know, we're learning now with the conversations with the Moscow Police Department. That's not easy sometimes. You know, our communities of color and our students of color, there is a fear, and that fear is not something that is just made up. It's something that comes with historical trauma in regards to policing and where policing has started and where it was established at. And what I've been really happy about is that Chief Fry and President Green have been willing to jump right in and listen and learn in regards to that. But we need more at the table. And then the hardest one is the commitment to stay the course, because the change will not come overnight. It's a whole systems process, and it's going to be ongoing, and it needs to go ongoing.
I think that's similar to a comment that we just saw from a viewer, which is that, you know, the scenario-based training is, you know, one that needs to continue, and, you know, repetition and, you know, variations, so that we can continue that. One, it continues that conversation, it continues that education, and it also allows us to learn from those experiences.
Mm-hmm. I think we've seen through the national agenda, community policing has moved beyond good public relations. It's talking about developing effective engagement to clearly understand your community needs and concerns. So there needs to be identified resources committed to these areas of the community to effectively support a safe, inclusive community.
So Mr. Gaither, I know you wanted to jump in there, and I want to make sure I give you that space.
Yeah, so Yolanda mentioned a word that I use a lot, but she mentioned trauma. And I just wanted to speak to that. I couldn't agree more. I think there needs to be more trauma-informed training on both sides, especially community members, because when we start talking about trauma, it's easy to bring up the trauma from the people of color, right? And the trauma from the marginalized communities. But there's trauma on both sides at times, right? Like Sheriff Skiles mentioned, you know, police are called names. Police are putting their lives on the line and are facing, you know, tough circumstances at times. You know, a lot of my police officer friends say that they feel like they're being targeted at times, right? So when we talk about trauma-informed training and communication and taking a trauma-informed approach, we can talk about it from both sides, right? And really discuss it where we can all kind of learn each other and sort of heal together. But that's the mindfulness coming out of me right now. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there.
Excellent. And Chief Fry, it looks like you have something to add as well.
Well, I just want to say that I agree. And I don't think that it doesn't lessen one group or the other. We're all going through some tough things, and that doesn't make what's happened to other community members any less important. Because I think we have to look at this holistically as a community and say that we're going to heal our whole community and make things better.
Excellent. Well, I do want to make sure we are, oh, I'm sorry, Sheriff Skiles, if you have I want to make sure I give you space as well.
Yeah, just really briefly. We actually have a policy manual that talks about just how we're supposed to treat people. And I actually have a mission statement that's actually in a poster on the wall at the sheriff's office that every deputy and every person who works, I have 52 employees, everybody who walks by that every single day they're working, they see the mission statement. And it talks about how we treat people equally no matter what. And no matter what the situation is or whatever your race or skin color or anything is, our mission statement really, it's a big poster on the wall, and I'm pretty proud of it, actually. And it didn't come from just me sitting down going, hey, this is going to be our mission statement. It came from a joint effort. I basically sat down all of my employees and I said, hey, take a couple weeks, take 2 or 3 weeks or a month. Let's work on our mission statement, how we feel as a body, how we feel as a team. And we came up with a mission statement that we all agree on. And what I felt really proud about that was it wasn't just my mission statement. It wasn't like, we're going to treat everybody just this way or whatever. It came from my people that work for me. And it really sent a signal to me that I have a really good crew that works for me that cares about other people. The mission statement was really, it really meant a lot to me because it came from my team. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Thank you.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to our making sure that our leaders are kind of walking the walk and talking the talk and doing those things and setting that standard, but getting that buy-in from those who all are a part of the organizations, but then making sure that we carry that forward and through into our experiences as we integrate and work with our community and interact with our community and what that looks like. So I think that's wonderful to hear. I do want to kind of make sure that it sounds like a lot of, we've got a lot of our conversation. It sounds like we may need to touch on an aspect of this that's about developing or building some sort of trust. And so I think, nationally, we've seen a lack of trust from our diverse communities with law enforcement. And so I'm just going to toss this question out there for everyone, whoever wants to jump in first. But what do you think the barriers are to good police-community relations? I think we've heard some of those. And what are some of the steps that we can maybe take to eliminate them here in our community? Mr. Gaither jumped off mute first.
Oh, I didn't do that on purpose, I don't think.
Okay.
I'll do it. Absolutely. So I think, it's important for police departments to really know the climate of the community. And when I say the climate of the community, in terms of multiple communities, right? And when we talk Moscow, the community of Moscow, for example, or Pullman, we're talking about multiple communities such as student athletes, students, business owners, to residents, residents that just arrived, that just got here, residents that's been here for generations, right? And some community members or some communities may believe the police officers are doing a great job. And then there's some that may see police officers as a threat, and some may be terrified. And knowing and having a plan of action, but then that knowledge is important to know which communities and who they are and where they are that are feeling this way, and having that have those feelings. Of course, when something happened on the national scene, such as a George Floyd, it's going to take that. It's going to take that trust and that relationship back. It just will, because when it comes to policing with marginalized communities, particularly Black communities, there's just history. There's just a history there of police departments sort of being in cahoots with the forms of oppression, the structural oppression that's taking place in that community, in that city, where they are being disproportionately policed compared to the suburbs, the nice suburbs across town or across the tracks. And so Pullman may not have that experience, but that resident that student athlete may have had that experience from the town that they grew up in. So the barriers, I think, starts with the knowledge, and so we're discussing for the WSU Police Advisory Board is putting out an annual community survey, where we're trying to find out what's going on with the community. So, I think surveys are great, a community survey, but it can't just be a one-time survey. Maybe a 5-year plan of a survey for 5 years, annually, to sort of track that and measure that progress to see if you're making some progress or pushing the needle in the right direction. Secondly, I think is contact. It's just more contact. Like we both mentioned, when the community know what the police officers are facing, right? And the day-to-day challenges that they're going through, right? And there's an understanding there. And then the police officers can hear the stories of maybe my story, for example. When I was 15, a police officer, I was driving with I was riding in the car with 3 of my sophomore and high school friends. And we was pulled over for an expired license plate. And, we didn't even know what a registration was. We only had one guy in the car that was 16. And he just got his driver's license. So we're all searching the car for the registration. And the officer put out a gun on us. He told us to put the hands where we could see him, and that story that's my personal story, but that stuck with me, right? So of course, in my body, when I'm around police officers, I'm a little bit more nervous. I feel it in my body. My hands may shake a little more. It's just there. So understanding the why, if you see this tall 6'3" Black man a little nervous when a group of police officers is around, hearing my story and hearing the stories of others. So just understanding that there is a history there too, that we can't just gloss over. I think is important for officers to understand and to be willing to sit with that.
Chief Fry, you look like you wanted to add
And
something.
I think that's an important points with what we're doing with the focus group. We're listening to students tell their stories. We're understanding that, but I think it's also important, the implicit bias training that we've been going through, where we're learning about some of our possible biases that maybe we didn't even know we had. And I think that's important for us to continue to hear those stories and understand that Moscow, Idaho is a very unique place, but it's not where people have come from. It's not their story, and they have those feelings when they get here, and we have to overcome that and work harder, being law enforcement officers, to let them know that we are here to protect them and we are here to serve them, no different than anybody else.
So Mr. Gaither, I kind of want to touch on something that you brought up. You'd mentioned the kind of the both that, both Chief Fry mentioned the working group with University of Idaho, and you are a co-chair of a working group with WSU. But what are some of the effective strategies that you've seen that would be helpful to help kind of build that trust? I mean, what have you seen work well, or either with your current committee that you're working on or in other areas across the nation?
So in North Carolina, I was a mediator, a certified mediator for the court system. And I would facilitate these difficult conversations, these difficult dialogues between the community and the police department. And it was, just being in a group of 20 to 30 people with police officers not in uniform, but just having conversation and asking the difficult question of, okay, if you were in, or your child was in trouble, would you feel safe calling the police? And why or why not? And having those difficult conversations and being able to provide tools to be able to sit with those difficult conversations so there's a container for healing and growth, I think is great. So it's all about sort of creating those spaces where that happens more often. So with WSU on the Police Advisory Board, we're creating ad hoc subcommittees where we're working with the chief of police and creating, donuts and dialogue with the Black Student Athletes Association, the Women's Center, and other groups across campus, where we're just going to let the police department just sit with them and get to know them. So we're calling it Donuts and Dialogue. It's not an original title, but that's what we're using. That's one way that we're trying to push the needle. And we really do believe that contact is what's important. The more they see officers, preferably out of uniform, because there's something about the badge that can make a lot of some students of color a little antsy. or afraid to be open and honest, afraid they might get in trouble. But yeah, we're doing that in partnership with our Black Faculty and Staff Association. And yeah, we just want to get our WSUPD in front of as many community and as many stakeholders and community members as possible. We just hosted a public safety summit in Pullman with the WSU chief and the Pullman chief, discussing for the same reason. So that's really important. And again, you know, the climate surveys, community surveys, I believe is really important. So we can gather the data and make sure we can create measurable goals.
Absolutely. That's the academic coming out, which is making sure that we have measurable goals and we can set up a plan for ourselves. So I think one of the things that we've talked about is, you know, in this discussion kind of, you know, a little bit earlier is this concept of unconscious bias, and where people may have values or thoughts about certain diverse communities that they're not aware of, or that may impact their behavior. And research is really finding more that this unconscious racial bias can impact that behavior. And so I would like to ask our law enforcement colleagues about, I guess, one of the questions that's come up recently in the Q&A chat is, you know, what are some of those trainings that are going on, and what does that look like?
Well, as you know, the police department, we've been through 2 implicit bias trainings just in the last 6 months. They also get a little bit of training down at the academy with cultural diversity and balancing bias training, and then just ethical decision making and effective communication. It all ties into, I think, some of that. But I think the biggest part for us is we'll be looking in the future. What else? I know that in March, I'm bringing another individual in for some implicit bias training, and we're going to do it for the whole city-wide, not just the police department, because you know, we're all in need of different trainings like that, and we'll be inviting the university as well to that. So that'll be something to look forward to in probably March or April.
Excellent. Yes, Sheriff Giles.
And so what I did probably about, and Chief Fry knows about this, but probably about 2 months ago, well, I actually had scheduled it about 5 months ago, but because of COVID and everything, but they have we rescheduled, and they had, I brought in a speaker from North Idaho and basically he teaches a class, and it's called Verbal Judo. And actually I went over and I spoke to Henry Ann and some of the people at the courthouse, and we decided as a group, I think there's 160 employees that work for Latah County all together. We decided as a group that everybody should take that class. It's a class on how to talk to people and how to de-escalate. And so all of my deputies went through that. A lot of us, I've been through it twice myself personally. It was a good class. It's an 8-hour class. Essentially, this speaker comes down and talks about how to de-escalate, talks about different races and things, and how to talk to people and how to make a situation a better situation that's actually out of control already. So got a lot of good positive feedback on that. I've been through the class myself. I highly recommended it. And when I talked to the courthouse, they were really on board with it. And so everybody went in together and paid for it together. And most everybody that works for me went through it. I kind of made it a mandatory thing. So there's a lot of classes. There's classes out there that we can take. Chief Fry and I can have our employees take. Him and I have been to a lot of them ourselves already because we have years of experience and been to the classes. But it's really important to bring our people that are under us up and have them attend these classes. And some of them, they need to be mandatory, just so we know how to talk to people, whatever your race, skin color is. So.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. This concept of de-escalation, and particularly nationally, how we've really seen that some of the stops in the media and the news stories with police can really seem to escalate out of control. And so I guess I'd like to invite anybody on the panel to answer a question about, like, how can we, what steps can we take? what training is out there, what reporting options are available, what steps can we take to maybe help de-escalate situations, difficult situations, and prevent that unnecessary violence. So in addition to that training that Sheriff Skiles talked about.
I think de-escalation training starts at the academy. I think that's where we touch on the scenario base, but then it comes back when they get back to Moscow, or they're in a 16-week field training where they're with a mentor and they're having somebody walk through each scenario they go on while they're on the taking calls, and they talk about those things, and they work on that de-escalation. There's also about 62 hours of defensive tactics that the students take while they're at the Post Academy, and they also have to go through a 64-page handbook on de-escalation so that they're getting the book education side of it, but then it's being put into practice. So I think that's important for us to continue that through their careers while they're in defensive tactic training and firearms training, and just even briefing trains that they go through and they can discuss things.
Excellent.
So Aaron, I would have had a different perspective on that. I'm not a police officer and I'm not aware of what all the de-escalation training happens, but I also think it's about community relationship building. If you have a relationship with your community members, it becomes easier to build that trust to be able to engage more effectively, I think, with people. And I'm not saying that there aren't going to be instances where that needs to happen. It does need to happen, but I think that's a critical part that's missing is that community engagement. And as Chief Fry had mentioned, we had started that with our students through the focused group. And I think both he and President Green will attest that the stories that they heard from these students was probably had such big impact on them that, they learned more about the experiences of our students of color, and got a little peek behind the window about, some of these encounters that they face and why there is so much distrust. That I think that is a critical piece, is just being able to come together. I also think one of the strategies to be able to address that is that we have to acknowledge what we don't know, right? And that means that we have to be able to recognize our own unconscious bias, like you've mentioned, and we all have it, but we also have to figure out how do we deal with it. And we have to ask ourselves, how does it appear in our work environment or in our community engagement? And if we're not intentional about looking at it that way, then we're going to miss the mark on it. And it means community engagement, seeing who's not a part of your community, who are living here, who are not engaged, and learn about their histories, their culture, and their language. And that's a critical part of being culturally responsive, and knowing who your communities are and who they are, where they come from. And then ask yourselves, why are they not engaging? Why are we not seeing our community members feeling welcome, a part of this community? That means we're not engaging. And often we ask our underrepresented communities to come to us. Well, I invite them to come down to, a social or an event, and they're not coming. It's on them. It's time for us to think about, how do we go to them? How do we go to their space? We ask them to walk into our doors and forget who they are, but how do we walk into their space and build that community relationship? So I would just add that.
I just want to throw something at the end of that. How do we go in their space and get them involved in their own solutions?
Exactly.
I just wanted to, Thank you for that, Yolanda.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's extremely powerful. I think, I appreciate this. It's meeting people where they're at, and rather than trying to get them to come to us, that's something that we've learned in various facets of education, academia, training, whatever it might be. And so it seems like a logical next step, right, to apply that to our community policing, to our law enforcement as well. So I love that. Thank you. I want to make sure, because we are getting close to our time frame on the pre-planned questions, I want to make sure we get maybe at least one more in there before we transition to some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A and the chat, which as we've kind of, the ones that have come up that have been relevant to ongoing discussions, I've been trying to integrate those in as we have them. But again, please feel free to continue to enter those as we go along. So one of the other questions that we kind of want to talk about is this concept or this theme of accountability, which is a pretty important aspect of kind of in earning that trust with the community, and then in turn really being able to have trust with law enforcement, as that seems like a pretty critical component of that community policing. So I guess for Chief Fry and Sheriff Skiles, what are some of those steps, or what does it look like for your department if there's something that gets identified in the department where maybe there's a bias or an issue that needs to be addressed and held accountable, particularly if it's specific to a community of color? What does that look like in your department?
I think with ours, I would be looking at a couple of things. I'd be looking at if it's an explicit bias or if it's an implicit bias, because I think those carry a little bit different weight in my mind. And then I would also be looking at our city policy, which we have a policy on biases for many different reasons, because of your race, gender, sexual orientation, all that. So I'd be looking at that, and then I would be looking at is there a violation of law? If there's a violation of law, is it an internal policy issue, or is it a violation of law? If it's a violation of law, I'd be asking an outside agency to come in and do that investigation along with an internal investigation to see what's going on. But a lot of times with these, they may not be known, so we'd be bringing more training in and trying to make people aware of it to move them along and the way that they're thinking.
Sheriff Skiles, do you have anything to add from your county perspective?
I do, just a couple things. I didn't want to interrupt earlier, but the survey thing I think is a really good idea, and I think Mr. Gaither said that. And I think that because that's basically a survey is a feedback. And so it helps when we get feedback from our citizens, it helps us to know what we are doing right or what we're not doing right. And so I think the survey thing's a good idea. I love reading that kind of stuff, and it gives us an idea of what we can do better. If somebody's treated, a little bit wrong or something, how can we do that better? And then the second thing that you brought up was meeting people where they are. Is that what you said? Meeting people where they are at. So I want you to know that we meet a lot of people on a daily basis. Every single call we go to is where they're at. And what you said about that, I thought was really interesting, because a lot of the calls that we go to, and I even still take calls and go to things as a sheriff, we meet people right where they're at, and it's usually not in the best spot for them. So part of our training and our policy manual and all that stuff helps us to help these people to get into a better spot than where they're at when we first meet them. We can't solve all their problems, obviously, but if we treat them right with dignity and respect, we can sure gain that respect that we're looking for and that relationship that we're looking for. I just want to tell you a really quick story. I arrested a gal. I'd been a deputy in 1996 for about 6 months, and I arrested a gal for aggravated battery. And I took her to the sheriff's office from Kendrick, Idaho, so it was a half-hour drive. We got there. She said she was that I was different, that she was treated with dignity and respect. And I think that's how you first of all, you've already been arrested. I don't have to do anything to make you feel worse, because being arrested is actually enough in itself to make you feel bad. So if you've been arrested for something, you still treat that person with dignity and respect. And then so to make a long story short, about 12 years later, she saw me at the Locust Blossom in Kendrick. I hadn't seen her for a while, and she brought a friend over that she was with and said, "Hey, I just want you to meet the sheriff that I know, and he treated me well when I was in my worst what you say, meeting people where they're at. When she was in her worst scenario, I still treated her with dignity and respect. And that's where you build these relationships that you're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And it actually goes to one of the questions that's come in the Q&A, which is, there's sometimes for some folks, it can be this perception that there's this switch, right? When somebody, they're no longer a community member, they don't have that same feeling as a community member once they become a suspect or something like that. And so, how do we work to treat those individuals with that respect and dignity? So I don't know if you, Sheriff Skiles or Chief Fry, can speak to, how do we accomplish that when those folks are in our custody and maybe having, like you said, on the worst day of their life?
People are just people, and they make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And so I think that once, like if I need to arrest somebody, or I go to a call and I talk to somebody and they're going through a time, the experience Chief Fry and I have, and we hope that we train it through education and stuff to our employees, our experience, you lead by example. And our experience is, I hope that experience through all the years that we've got helps that person be in their worst time, helps that person be get through their worst time and be a better person. I mean, there's been people that we've arrested more than once, but I've also arrested people, or had people have been arrested 3 or 4 times, and they finally come around. So everybody has their issues and their downtime and everything, but there's a time when they have a high time too. And if you treated them with dignity and respect, I've had actually people call me, and I'm sure Chief Fry has too, because him and I think a lot alike, but hey, I could give you names, which is really kind of cool. I can trust you. I've known you for a while, and I want to tell you about what's going on down the street. It's something that's not that great. If it's drug related or something else, a domestic, somebody not treating somebody well or whatever. And so you build that trust through actually doing the right thing and leading by example. So,
Chief Fry, do you have anything to add on maybe how we can kind of continue to treat people who might be on that more suspect side as people? How does that work for you all? What does that look like?
I think we always have to just treat people with dignity. I think that goes the furthest that you can do. Sometimes you have to have compassion for their situation. Sometimes we can't even relate to their situation because we've never lived through that experience. No different than individuals coming here from other areas. We don't know their history. We don't know what trauma they've gone through. But I think as you continue to train officers and we train them a specific way, we do have people there's some people that aren't going to like us. That's just the reality. But we work very hard to treat everybody the same. And in the end, we want, best case scenario is that people do thank us in the end, even though it was a tough situation for all of us.
I think, one of the things that I'm wondering is, if a person of color maybe has a specific concern or would like to file a complaint or a grievance, I don't know, I'll throw this out to anybody, but what do you think the best way is for somebody to communicate that if they've had a negative experience or have a specific issue with an officer or concern that's arose? Yes, Mr. Gaither.
I'll jump in. I'll tell you what I think. I'm not a police officer though, but for the police advisory board, we encouraged WSU, and we're just talking about WSU PD, not Pullman PD, to put file a complaint online where it's visible, it's easy to find. It's on the WSU PD webpage where they could, if someone feels like they were being discriminated against or harassed by the police in any way, they can file that complaint. Now, those complaints go directly to our chief, which is one way of doing it. I'm one of the ones that think that a citizens review board would be more transparent, and that would be real accountability to me. Whenever citizens throughout the community can actually read those, and those are made more visible, perhaps to an advisory board or what have you. I think that whenever we talk about those harassments and those things, it's easy to kind of narrow down on that single issue, but we also have to keep it in the context of the big picture. Okay, and by big picture I mean the historic inequities. In 2015, there were 991 police shootings where people were shot and killed by police. 991, 0 convictions. In 2014, there were 0 convictions of all the police shootings, 0. So when we think about accountability, that comes to mind as well. Like historically, there's individuals, there's members of our community that don't believe that police are held accountable when they kill Black and brown people. I'm not saying I'm one of those people, but I'm saying when you look at the numbers, when you look at someone like Eric Garner, I'm not going to talk about George Floyd, too close, that's too recent. But when you look at Eric Garner, who was choked to death for selling loose cigarettes, and the only person convicted of anything was the cameraman that filmed it. He was sent to 60 days in solitary confinement. He was the only one convicted of any charge. And the world watched that and said, hey, how did that happen? How did that police officer get off? How was there no conviction? How was there no indictment in some cases? Right? And so it goes to a much larger issue. It goes to grand juries now needing implicit bias training, right? And asking, why is it that this person can easily be vilified as a villain, as a criminal, and this person can easily be seen as, hey, they're just trying to do the right thing. They have a tough job. So I believe there needs to be more accountability, but it's a much bigger issue than just these a website where you can file a complaint.
Dr.
So
Bisley?
I would agree as well. You know, it is a bigger issue than that. And I had pointed that out in my opening comments, that it really is a structural issue. And it's unfortunate that it's falling on the police to be the ones to address that, because it goes through the whole court system, you know, through the police department, through the commission, through city council, all of that, all the bureaucracy. It's there. So I think that there needs to be some intentional focus on how is that addressed. But I think for in the most simplistic terms, and unfortunately, as a bias team co-chair along with you, Aaron, we do see bias reports come through from the city. The city has community members who will file something about an incident that they had. And it's really not within our purview to be able to address those if they're not students. But a positive and fortunate thing is that we have Chief Fry at the table and his officers there as part of the Bias Response Committee. Now, I need to point out that the Bias Response Committee is not a disciplinary action or a one who's going to engage with students. That's all held through the Dean of Students. The Bias Response team is only there to collect the data and look at where we could provide educational programming to address these issues. And I think that's something that would be very beneficial for the city, because there's a lot of people within the community who are encountering bias who don't know where they can go to report those things. So it would be, in a sense, an assessment or survey as you watch it and you collect these reports and you try to engage, provide comfort and care to those who maybe have encountered the bias response, the bias incident, and start building some programming around how are you doing that as a community to address the bias there. So I would strongly encourage something to happen like that within the city.
And I guess being a part of the bias team, what I want to say is that if I saw something that rose to a different level of bias, I would address it back to the city and through the proper channels, as well as if anything else needed to be taking place with that. So it doesn't just fall on deaf ears because it's not part of the university purview, I could then carry it through. So that does happen with that at least.
Mhm.
Sheriff Skiles, I know you had your hand up at one point, and I didn't want you to think I didn't see you there, but I didn't know if you had anything to add with regard to, if individuals experience specific issues or have concerns, what actions or steps can they take? I didn't know if you had any other thoughts on that. The moment may have passed, but I wanted to make sure I give you the opportunity.
Well, I just real quickly, I wanted to say accountability is very huge, and it's in my mission statement. I think if you are you're in a small area with a small department, you're going to have more accountability because it's harder to get away with something. And I think it was Mr. Gaither. There in a large department, there's a lot of time. I mean, like a city department where there's a couple 100,000 people. I think, and it's unfortunate, but I do think things do slip through the cracks, and it's very unfortunate. It doesn't mean it's okay by any means. But I think in smaller departments like mine and Chief Fry's, we're kind of in a medium-sized department, and so I think that I think we can kind of keep track of things a little better and hold people accountable. And so it's harder to hide something in a smaller department or in a smaller community. So we are very blessed to live where we live. As far as the size of our departments and our cities and stuff, it's hard to sweep things under a carpet. And so Chief Fry and I don't tolerate that at all. Who will be here after me? I don't know who was here before me. I don't know what was tolerated or what wasn't, but I believe in accountability. I believe that if we could figure out a way, I have social media. I have a Facebook page. If something's really bad, if somebody can reach out, I have a person that oversees that, and they bring things to me on a regular basis, good or bad. And I do agree also with Mr. Gaither that it's not good just to have one person in charge of here's the complaint, here's a complaint, here's a complaint, because that person might be too busy or maybe not even care. So it's important to have a committee, maybe that person and 2 or 3 people on it, and somebody from the city or a citizen or whatever. It wouldn't hurt my feelings a bit. So thank you for that.
One of the questions that, since we're kind of transitioning to the questions that are coming in from the community members, Sheriff Skiles has come up is, if you wouldn't, I don't know if you know off the top of your head or be able to point us in the direction of the mission statement that you all have. And is it specific to the county? Is it standardized across the state? It sounded like this was something that you all developed internally. But would you be able to kind of tell us a little bit more about that, what it includes or where to point us to find it?
So I have it. You're very welcome. I don't have it memorized, obviously. I do have it on my phone somewhere, but I don't want to interrupt what we're doing. You're welcome, very welcome to come up to the sheriff's office. It's right on the wall. It's right on my wall for employees to walk by it, and it reminds us each day of what we're there for and what we're supposed to be doing. So anybody would be welcome. And I could, if you want to text me, people have my number. I've given out my numbers since day one. A lot of people contact me. I'm not an untouchable or unreachable type of sheriff. You can contact me, and I can give you my number, and I can send that. I can take a picture of it tomorrow or take it off my phone and text it to you. And so screenshot it or whatever. And that way you can see our mission statement. I think Chief Fry, I don't think there may be each department has one that's maybe similar. But if you've taken the time like I have, and I'll let my employees develop this, it's not just a generic one.
And I'll just say across the board, there's no standard policy and procedure manual per se for, like, my policy and procedure manual is different from Sheriff Skiles. My mission statement's a little different from Sheriff Skiles. They say typically the same thing, that, we are here to serve the community. We are here to protect the community, and we want to do that with integrity and compassion. So they're all fairly similar, but they have a meaning, and it gives us a roadmap to how we want to police our communities.
Well, I think that brings up another question that, or issue that ties into another question, which is kind of these training manuals and these frameworks that you all have within the departments. You know, is it something that gets updated regularly when new situations occur, when we get new information that kind of go beyond current understanding and training? Can you talk to us a little bit about those training manuals, how they work, how they're updated, and that process?
So my policy and procedure manual gets updated every year. After I get done updating it, I send it over to our city attorney, who reviews it to make sure it all falls within the guidelines of laws. Our training manual, we just updated our field training manual to be more scenario based and to be just, it wasn't a bad field training program that we had before, but we knew there was some updating we needed to do. And you have to change with times. You can't keep things stagnant and expect to grow. So we do update those typically on a yearly basis.
Sure, Skiles. What about the county?
So ours, you know, if something, we basically will have updates. They're reviewed obviously annually, but if there's something that comes up before a yearly time is up, and I'm sure with Chief Fry too, probably, if something's needs addressed, it gets addressed and changed. I can get updates on my policy manual through the Sheriff's Department. We update ours on a regular basis. So if something comes from the policing policy manual from where I get mine, which is out of Boise, run through the Sheriff's Association and stuff. So mine's a little bit different than Chief Fry's, but kind of the same, if that makes sense. But anyway, we will update on a regular basis to, number one, you have to avoid lawsuits. Lawsuits are pretty easy. A lot of people will sue if they can for some reason. If they have a legitimate lawsuit, I am all for that. If you have a lawsuit that's not really legitimate, policy helps protect us in those lawsuits. And one thing Chief Fry and I don't need is bad press. So the newspaper, if something bad happens in his agency or mine, we'll get, you know, the newspaper wants to come and they want to tell the people what happened or whatever. And so far in the last 4 years, I've had zero negative press. I've built relationships with the press. Right off the bat, when I took office, we had an escapee from Lewis County came into Latah County, and just a few days before that, Clue TV had got a hold of me and said, "Well, we really want to, you know, build relationships." I said, "So do I." And so they actually drove by that scenario. We were down in Kendrick, and we were looking for this escapee, and we couldn't find him. And Clue TV stopped, and they said, "Hey, can we, you know, help?" And I said, "Yeah, come and get right in the middle of this." And I held this guy's picture up for channel 3 TV so all the residents that watch the news could say, "Hey, this is the guy we're looking for, and he escaped from Lewis County, and you could be in danger, so lock your doors, and if you see him, give us a call right away, dial 911." And that's how you start building relationships, is when they say, "Hey, can we build a relationship?" And then you bring them right in, they go, "Yeah, this guy means what he says." So that kind of stuff is helpful in building relationships. Media is huge. It's really huge. And it needs to be on our side for the people and for us.
So this kind of, I think, ties in a little bit. I'm gonna try and tie it in anyway. This accountability aspect that we've kind of been continuing to talk about. One of the questions that's come up from one of the attendees is the surrounding qualified immunity. How does qualified immunity factor in? How does it ending it factor in? What does that look like for building these relationships moving forward?
Chief Fry, I got a little bit I could say about that. To me, I'll just say it really quick, and then Chief Fry can talk. And I don't want to take all the video time for sure. But qualified immunity is something that I don't really look at that heavily. I look at the actions. So if you are a deputy and you do something, I have to look at your actions. Were you right? Were you wrong? And then I proceed from there. If you trip, I've had a couple deputies do a couple things that weren't, that were in violation of policy. You take care of it right away. What do they say? You nip it in the bud or whatever. You don't want anything to get swept under a carpet because that's bad press or that's a lawsuit or anything like that. I haven't, thank you. I haven't had, thank you God, I haven't had any lawsuits or anything like that. We just do things right to begin with, and then you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff.
Any other thoughts from other members, panelists? Okay. One of the other questions that has come through that I want to make sure we offer Dr. Bisbee an opportunity to answer is, maybe telling us a little bit more about the bias response team at the University of Idaho. If you can share with us a little bit more about their role, what they do, and what that looks like.
Sure. So the bias response team is comprised of university staff, faculty, and students who come together, and we review bias reports that have been turned into our Vandal Care. And it's just an online database that we promote for students to file if they've encountered bias. And so we meet bi-weekly, and if there's a report, there's good weeks and bad weeks on when we will have how many reports we have to review. But it's really just looking at the report that a student or a faculty or even a staff member maybe have filed on the bias incident, and then trying to find the appropriate support for that person who filed the bias as follow-up to make sure that they're feeling safe and secure because of the bias report. And then it gets filed, and then what we do is we look at it to say, well, is there something going on maybe that we are doing in educational programming that we could target in this area that would help us engage in broader conversations, with whoever committed the bias response, or inform the community more about, the biases that are occurring. So, and that's what's the benefit of having all those stakeholders at the table, because they all have different expertise and they all come from different units across the campus, and they're able to help with those types of things. So, yeah, that's how we do it, unless there's any other questions, or even Erin could even answer that one.
Well, I'm wondering too, Mr. Gaither, if there's anything, WSU on that kind of the other side of the border there that is similar in nature. What does it look like? Does it differ? I didn't know if you had any insight on that.
Yeah, we have a lot of different initiatives that's taking place right now, and different groups. So right now we have our Office of Equity and Inclusion that's doing a lot of work around that, and we actually have peer educators that work alongside of them, which are students. So we do not have, and I think I threw that in a chat with Dr. Bisbee, we do not have like a bias committee, and I was very interested in learning more about that, because I think that's fascinating that U of I is doing that work.
Well, there's another question that came up around the bias committee that is wondering if the bias response team addresses community bias instances. And so I think we touched on that a little bit, but the follow-up question to that was, would a bias response team be beneficial for the community at large? So I'm curious if there are thoughts on those two questions.
Yes, I believe so. And I think I mentioned that in the previous comment, that I think it would be very beneficial for the city or the community. Again, it lets you know more about, gauge what's happening in your community with bias. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about the police department. It's about anything. We've had an incident with somebody who's had trouble within her apartment, and someone who has trouble in the school with her kids facing racism. There's a span of different things that we hear from the community that gets funneled through our response team. So, and then in turn, we try to look at community agencies that maybe can reach out for comfort and care, or again, engaging Chief Fry in some of those incidences. But again, I need to emphasize we're not a disciplinary action. If anything crosses the legal line, it goes to the Office of Civil Rights and Investigation, and we don't look at that other than comfort and care to the person who experienced it, and goes to the Dean of Students if there's any kind of disciplinary action. So We're really just there looking at educational programming and how we support the student who encountered the bias.
I'd just like to add one thing that I'd like to maybe stack onto that, Yolanda, is maybe we should do it even countywide, because we have so many small communities that are so close to Moscow that it could be a Latah County-wide committee that looks at stuff, because I think things probably happen in these small communities too that maybe aren't brought forward because it's not in Moscow.
Yeah.
Well, and I know the Moscow Human Rights Commission has definitely had conversations about at least trying to figure out how to track these issues that come up in these reports. Where can people go? What can they do? How can we look to see if there's a way to recognize any patterns, any maybe particular areas or issues that are becoming problematic? And so I would encourage for those folks who are interested in learning more about that or helping to support that, to reach out to the Moscow Human Rights Commission. And maybe one of our background moderators can help by dropping the email address for our chair in there, Kenneth Fonts, to be able to attend on our upcoming meetings, or being able to offer. We always have an opportunity for the public to speak. So if that's something of interest, I would encourage you to get engaged and reach out and ask about that. So we're getting close on time here, and as I said, I was going to try and get to all of our questions. It's just not going to happen. But one of the questions that has come up that I think is maybe a subset of the population, but how are the local, the MPD and the sheriff's office, how are we reaching out to engage our local youth? And what are those conversations looking like? And I guess tell us a little bit more about what's happening with our youth.
I think one of our contact points, and our SRO program, school resource officer, we don't have them in the schools to be there as a disciplinary action. We have them there to build rapport with kids and build rapport with students. We also have the Renewable Safety Fair, which we have every year, but this year because of COVID, where we're engaging with kids and giving them helmets and doing different things. We also have a yearly where we go do a cookout for the high school kids and just talk to them and spend time just chatting with them. But a lot of our engagement comes through the schools, obviously, and the programs that we have within the schools. So we're going to continue to do that, but there's always new avenues for us to reach out with our youth, and we're always looking for something new to be able to have a positive engagement with them.
Sheriff Skiles, do you have anything to add?
I do, thank you. So the first 3 years of my career, in 1996 to 1999, I was actually a school resource deputy for Kendrick. And I really believe in school resource, that contact. And so when I took office 4 years ago, I went to the county commissioners and I said I needed some funds to get a designated sheriff's deputy to be able to go to the schools and just focus on the schools. So we didn't really have that so much. We had a guy that would, go to the schools when he could before I took office. And I wanted one that actually could focus on the schools and be designated. And Chief Fry and I put forth a pretty big effort to have that contact in the schools. So it builds trust with the kids. 20 years later, I have no kids that I was the school resource in Kendrick, and I see them once in a while and they remember me from 20 years ago. So I think that relationship is huge. We have that program and we strongly believe in it. And it's where things start, actually, because they're youth and they're younger kids. And so my deputy goes from school to school on a regular basis, and he doesn't even take calls unless he's right on top of it. His focus is the school. So that's huge.
Excellent. Mr. Gaither, I want to kind of maybe circle back to you on this question as well. You mentioned your personal experience with law enforcement. Any ideas on how we can engage our youth or our college-age individuals, and maybe you build that relationship and trust and kind of help to bridge that gap, avoid maybe the experiences that you've had, or rebuild trust when those experiences occur? Any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I first want to say that in Pullman, I don't believe an officer has discharged his weapon since the 70s. So, I mean, that's pretty cool. I think it's important for the Black community to know that. I think that a good place to start for police officers is Black student athletes and student athletes of color. They're from all over the country, perhaps sometimes all over the world. They come with different experiences. And this place is probably new to them, very foreign to what they're used to. I'd say start with them, interact with the Women's Center of the campus, and the organizations that you've already mentioned, without your uniform on. Sort of neat. Get out of the car. Find them on foot. Of course, these are virtual platforms right now, so that's not necessary. But when COVID is over, shoot some ball with the youth. But most importantly, really engage with the children, the resource officers. I would say they need make sure the resource officers are getting that implicit bias training. Nationwide, Black males are 3 times more likely to get suspended than their white counterparts. So keeping a close eye on that, because that's going to be the first experience that a lot of the youth around here is going to have with their resource officer. Or does the resource officer say hi to them? And this, so it starts with that. Yeah, I think it starts with the resource officers for sure, and the students seeing them out of uniform as well.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And I apologize. I wasn't trying to cut you off, but we are getting up right at to the end of time here. And so I do want to thank you all of our panelists, Chief Fry, Sheriff Skiles, Dr. Bisbee, Mr. Gaither, for your time, your contributions, this excellent discussion that we've had. I am going to apologize to all of you who submitted excellent questions that we just weren't able to get to. Of trying to weave things in as they were relevant to our topics of discussion, but I want to thank you all and know that we can't end the conversation here. So again, I encourage you to mark your calendars for our next discussion on December 8th at 5 p.m., where we're going to continue to explore how to strengthen these relationships with community and law enforcement through the lens of mental health and crisis intervention. And if this is another panel that you would like to see happen again, and we can revisit it, please reach out, let us know. We'd love to try and schedule something else. Again, these conversations can't end. So thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists for your time, for your engagement, and we look forward to seeing you at our next discussion on December 8th. Have a great evening.